Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, Chanel. Thank you for all you did to get us ready for this. Hey, thanks for joining today. I know many of you are going to be live. Some of you are going to be watching this from a recording. But the thing we're going to talk about today has to do with decision making, because we are faced with it all the time. Like, do we do this or do we do that? And it can cover so many different aspects of our lives and our careers. And what I want you to do is just use the chat window right here real quick. If you had to type into the chat window, how would you summarize how you go about making a decision? Okay. Now, this could pretty seriously vary based on if somebody was, if you're trying to decide where to go to lunch or whether you're trying to take a job. But just, you don't have to like elaborate in many paragraphs, but in brief, use the chat window and say, what are some things you'd say about how you would, what you would include or consider when you're making a decision, okay? So, use the chat window. Yeah, know the problem. Think about the options, right there, John? I mean, that's typically good saying, okay? And it's kind of like the both sides of that, Sabrina. Info and use your gut, right? Okay. Yeah, use some sort of prioritization, right? I mean, that's gonna be part of this for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything else come to mind and how you do it? I mean, these are pretty normal sort of things that people would say. It's like, well, I've got an issue. I'm going to try to consider what the options are. And let's see. I'm wondering, Chanel, I think Carlos is unmuted, and I think you're unmuted. I'm wondering if you could take care of that. That would be awesome. Thank you. So when it comes to making decisions, usually there's some variation of this, right? Like Chanel, like you said, there's the prior knowledge. There's, so use that. But we have a choice. We encounter a choice, and we go through our options, and we analyze those, and based on reliable information and our gut, based on priorities, and based on all kinds of things that we take into account, we make the choice. Interestingly, the step of this that people often don't think of is you live with the consequences. I mean, that's part of it as well, right? You have to live with the consequences there. Well, here's what I want you to do. This is not for the chat window. This is for you and you alone. But what I want you to do is, can you think of a decision that you've got coming up? It could be in the next week, it could be this weekend, it's a longer term decision, but it's something you need to make. What I would love for you to do is to write it down somewhere in front of you, because everything we talk about for the rest of our time together can come off as highly theoretical, or it can come off as very practical. But the way to keep it practical is to consider decisions that you have on your plate right now, okay? So if you could just write down, like, well, I mean, what is a decision that you've got coming up? What is that decision? If you could write it down, maybe you can think of one work one, and maybe you could think of one that would be outside of work. But if you keep these in mind as we go through the process, okay? So this session is heavily informed by this book by the Heath brothers, Decisive. I have to say it's one of my top 2 favorite books when it comes to decision making. And what they say in the book is that the villains, the things that make it difficult for us to make good decisions, would be these 4 things. Let's talk about them. The first one is just narrow framing. That one of the single biggest reasons why we have trouble making decisions or making good decisions, one of the biggest reasons why things don't turn out the way we think, is we just narrowly framed that there are more options than what we considered. Maybe we took the first good option. Like, as neuroscientists talk about, that we've got this mental spotlight, and none of us would ever say, I am all knowing, I see it all, but we act as if what we're looking at are the options. And so it's narrow framing. Cognitive biases is one of the villains. Cognitive biases, which just says it seems to be wired into us sometimes to be biased towards certain things. And one of the big ones is the confirmation bias. I bet you've heard about that before, right? Confirmation bias. Yeah. In fact, if you can think of, I can think of it when I buy something online. Right? I go and I look at the reviews if I really want this, I look for the reviews. I'm like, this is awesome. And for the people that give less than positive reviews or less than awesome reviews, like, I'm sure they're a bunch of whiners, right? I mean, we discount that. We discount the disconfirming data, and we end up making bad decisions because of this. Now, here's the deal. I host a podcast called the People and Projects Podcast. So I've had the opportunity to interview many different experts on topics related to leadership and project management. And one guy in particular, a guy named Michael Roberto, he's like, I've researched it, I write about it, I teach about it, and confirmation bias is still so difficult to counteract because it seems to be wired into us, but affects our decisions. In fact, Dr. Gary Klein, I had the opportunity to interview him about his book, Seeing What Others Don't. He says this, the more central the belief to our thinking, the harder it is to give up. And so when you're making a work decision, if you're making a decision, like I had a friend who was responsible for filling out the org chart during a reorg. And he had the option, do I put my name in this one? Or there's somebody else who'd be qualified as well. It's it's difficult to put someone else's name in there when my paycheck depends on my decision here. It's really difficult. We have these cognitive biases. And then there's short-term emotion. Short-term emotion can affect our decision making. I put this picture, you'd have to be a bit of a tech historian to appreciate this, but these would be the Intel Trinity here. And there's a point where Andy Grove and Gordon Moore were wrestling with what to do with the company. Now, when you think of Intel, like when I think of Intel, we think of microprocessors. But there was a day when Intel was all about memory chips. And you know what memory's like now, right? I mean, it's amazing. I've got a SD card right here. I mean, this SD card has as much memory on it that I used to require an entire room, right, to fill up. And so they were getting so much pressure. It was a cash cow. But, where's this market going to go? Should we stay in memories or not? And this is the question they asked each other. They said, no, wait. Let's try to take some of the emotion out of it. If we got fired, like let's say the board hires some new senior leaders and they got rid of us, what would that senior leader decide about staying in memories or not? And Gordon Moore served that question up. Andy Grove's like, they'd get out of memories. I mean, no question. And they're like, well, why don't we do that now? But see, sometimes when we're so close, the short-term emotion is hard to get around. Now, there's a lot you don't know about me, but I'm kind of wacky. And one of the ways I apply that is I think every once in a while, like, let's say I died, my wife remarried. What's something that loser's going to do that I'm not doing now? Hey, you know what? I better do that now. It's that same sort of thing. Well, sometimes we're so close to it that we think, what would someone else decide here? And so that's a villain, though, because we sometimes don't do that. And then there's overconfidence that, we make bad decisions because we're just overconfident at times. We think we know more than we do. I love this quote from Burston. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge. It's not, like, even think in your workplace when, every once in a while, aren't you like, what a bunch of idiots? Or like, why could they possibly decide that? Well, it's not necessarily that people are idiots necessarily. It's not that people are ignorant. What's the problem? The problem is what we think we know. It's this illusion of knowledge. In fact, Mark Twain said it in kind of a funnier way. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And when we're trying to make decisions, this overconfidence or this over-attributing our influence on things hurts. So we've got these villains here, right? We have to make a choice, but narrow framing means we miss out on options. And so we analyze our options, but we kind of look at the data that supports what we want, and we make a choice, but short-term emotion can tempt us to maybe go status quo or to fear the bigger thing that we need to take. You live with the consequences, but we remain overconfident in how it's going to work out. So that's how it works. So what do we do with this? Well, here's what I want to invite you to do. This is what we're going to cover today. First, you have to widen your options. You have to widen our options. And then when we're analyzing, we've got these assumptions. Let's reality test those assumptions. Okay? We got to make a choice, but let's get some distance here before we make that choice. Take the deep breath. Live with the consequences? Yeah. But how about this? Prepare to be wrong. When was the last time someone told you, hey, and by the way, when you make this decision, prepare to be wrong? Well, the way to remember this, the Heath brothers suggest this acronym, WRAP. Widen your options, reality test those assumptions, attain some distance before we decide, and then we prepare to be wrong. All right, let's talk about this. Let's start with the widen your options. I always get a bit of a kick out of how people make a living, and from a research perspective in particular. And there's this researcher, Fishoff at Carnegie Mellon, and he's like, I'm going to research teenage decision-making, which if you have teenagers, you think, seriously? You're going to try to like, draw lessons out of that? Well, this is what he did. He was trying to find out what are the decisions, what are the decisions that they've made recently? And so he got 105 teenage girls in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, whether it was school or parents or clothes, all these different things. And he's documented what kind of decisions were they making. Most common type, there was not even a choice at all. It was just statements of resolve, like I'm going to stop blaming others. I'm going to stop smoking. It really ultimately wasn't a decision. That was the number one. But you know what the number two was? A single option. A single option. Someone's just looking at one other option. Now, check this out. I'm deciding whether or not I should smoke cigarettes. I'm deciding whether or not I should break up with my boyfriend. Now, the first two, the statements of resolve in this one, represent 65% of them. So here's what I want you to do. Type into the chat window, what is similar between those two examples right here? What is similar between these? What would you say? Use the chat window here. When you look at these questions, they're deciding, I'm trying to decide, yeah, sorry, they're binary. That's exactly right. So we're trying to do this or that. It's the yes or no. And if you look at the phrasing, it's the whether or not. Here's if you get nothing else out of our session today, learn to watch for this pattern. I'm trying to decide whether or not to. And it could be there are plenty of situations where it is just binary, one of the two. But the problem is it's narrow framing. And if I had like these hypnotic powers, what I would say, next time you say, is there, we're trying to whether or not to, you'd be like, oh, remember that hawk talk where we just remembered that, that's the sign of narrow framing. Like, let's say one of those teenagers was trying to do this. I'm deciding whether or not I should go to the party tonight. Okay? Use the chat window here. Okay? I invite all of you to jump in if you have access to the chat window. What are some wider options than just that? I'm deciding whether or not I should go to the party tonight. Yeah, what are some other things tonight? Like, what's my hesitation? There must be something about that hesitation. Like maybe I'm competing with some homework. So one option is go to the party or stay home and do homework. Well, another option might be do some homework and then my reward for getting done is to go to the party. Maybe what I do is I go off and do something else and then go to the party late. It's not an or it's an and. Right? Maybe there's some people at the party. Of all the people that are going to be there, there's really only 2 or 3 that I really want to hang with. Maybe I invite them over at my place and we hang for a while and then they go to the party. You see what I'm saying? Now you might think, well, Andy, this is obvious, but it's not just a teenager issue. I mean, look at this. I'm trying to say, should I take this job opportunity or not? Should we ship it or should we delay the project? I'm trying to decide, do we ship it or not? Should I go for another degree? Should we buy this company? We are faced with these sorts of decisions. And if you can try to remember the whether or not. Here's a business example. 1983, Quaker acquires Gatorade for $220 million. Remember that number, okay? Maybe you had this as a case back in school. So maybe you actually used to work for Quaker or Gatorade. But here's the deal. $220 million, and he grew it to $3 billion. Wow, that's pretty cool. You know what? If you're in the business of acquisitions, that's a good day right there, okay? And so they're like, all right, what do we do next? Well, Gatorade was the thing there. Let's go for Snapple. Let's go for Snapple. I mean, what's the same? They're drinks, right? Let's do that. How much do they offer for Snapple? Well, $1.8 billion. Now, everyone thought that was a lot of money, but the thing is, Quaker was definitely a takeover target at the time, and so the thought was, well, how about this? We're taking on a lot of debt. we know how to grow the business, and so it'll pay off, but it also makes us less attractive for a takeover. So that seems all good, right? Seems good. Well, remember this number, 1.8 billion. What happens? Very different business. Only 3 years later, they sold it for $300 million. Now think about that. How much did they pay? $1.8 billion. They sold only 3 years later for $300 million. Man, that is brutal. And Smithberg said this after he stepped down. So much excitement. Get this new brand, a brand with legs. Should have had a couple of people arguing the no side of the evaluation. Because in this case, it wasn't even a yes or no. It was a yes or yes. What does it take to make it work? And so Paul Nutt, he goes, hey, listen, let's go beyond teenagers here. He looked at what looks like a small number of decisions, only 168, but what he did was he went a deep dive into these. And what he wanted to find out is he went to minutes of meetings. He talked to people that went through there. Yeah, exactly. So that's a great point there, Carlos. So by widening the options may require deeper understanding. In fact, it might lead to a deeper understanding of what the problem was in the first place as we kind of go through it. So what Nutt did here is he's like, let's look at these in detail. You know what he found? Only 29% of these considered more than one alternative. Everything else was they're trying to decide this or this. Only 29%, which is kind of funny because the teenagers were at least 30%. So it's, this problem is not just an issue with teenagers, that too often that's what we're doing. And so over the long term, what Paul Nutt found is that they failed 52% of the time. So when he went back, found out what was the type of decision, how did it turn out, 52% of the time it failed. And when they had two or more, number drops to 32% that failed. So once again, if we can try to find a way to force ourselves, are there more options? Because if we don't, this is what we're doing. How can I make this work? How can I get support for this? And let's face it, I mean, there are times in life that we could decide this or this. It's a matter of our commitment to make it work anyway, so I get that. And so eventually, you're going to have to try to make something work when we decide it. But too often, because of that confirmation bias like we talked about, or we just don't look at the options. Instead of this, we do this. So is there a better way? Is there another way? What's another alternative? That's what we're really trying to kind of spur on here. So here's the lesson. Distrust whether or not. Just use it as a trigger. I do far better. I mean, there's going to be a lot you're going to forget about our session today, but if you can learn to recognize patterns, and that one pattern is whether or not, that's a problem, okay? Now, Shane Frederick did a different study. Now, I'm really not up on the movies of what's like coming out this summer, but let's say there's a new 3D movie coming out, Fast and Furious 18 or something like that. I don't know, but it's going to be 3D. So it's a movie, let's say, that you really want to see. And so you go up to people and go, all right, so this is a movie coming out. It's $15. This is something that I know you said you want to see. So he asked it this way, binary. Go to the movie, don't go to the movie. That's how he'd ask it, okay? And so, I don't know. I mean, this is movies that people wanted to see. 75% of the people said, yeah, recommend that somebody goes, okay? So he changed the phrasing just this little bit and says, how about this? Go to the movie or don't go to the movie and keep the $15 for other stuff, okay? So do you think it changed the calculus at all there? Well, guess what? 45% of the people said don't go. Almost double the number of no's because of the way it was phrased. So just imagine if Quaker were to go, hey, buy Snapple or keep the 1.8 billion for other purchases. Right? It's the idea of opportunity cost. And this is so pernicious. It's so easy to not do it. Just recently, well, actually it was a year ago now. It was time for the Kaufmans to buy another car. And there was the car that I was looking at, a previous model year, but still on the lot, okay? So it's going to be less expensive. There was the new model year, and both of them new, haven't been, driven. But the new one had such better electronics. It was a little bit more, a little wider, and it was so hard to say, so how could I narrow frame this? I could say, I'm trying to decide whether or not to buy the new model year, or I'm trying to decide whether or not to just buy the old model year. Okay. Instead of saying, how about I buy the new model one, or I buy the old model one and take that $3,500 and go on a cruise with my wife. Okay. Now, by the way, I didn't ask that question. I bought the new model one because I didn't do this step here. It's just, I just fell in love. Confirmation bias. It's the bias towards the thing that, oh, I'm going to drive this thing forever, and I'll be happy every time I sit in it. I'm telling you, what if we started every decision by saying, what are we giving up here? Because the truth is, when you say yes to this, you're saying no to that. And so it's thinking through that opportunity cost. What else could we do? If we put our people on that project, what other things are we not doing because of that investment? So that's a way to kind of widen our options. There's also the vanishing options test, which I love this one. And so let me give you an example of this. I've got a friend named Ken. Ken, probably one of the smartest guys I ever hired. He's just a really smart guy. In fact, he was so smart, I almost didn't hire him because I'm like, I don't think we're going to be able to keep this guy happy. I don't know if we'll be able to keep him challenged, but I hired him anyway. It turned out to be a great thing for many years. He eventually left, and he took a job up in Minneapolis and did very well there for a while, but eventually lost his job. Now, let's say if any of you have gone through this, through transition, especially the higher you get up, sometimes it takes longer to get the job. And so I'd heard he was in between jobs, and I called him and I'm talking to him like, so, hey, Ken, how's it going? So when you ask somebody, how's it going during a job search, what are some of the responses you get? Use the chat window. Hey, Ken, how's it going, man? Okay. So use the chat window. What are some responses you get from people when you're like, so how are things looking? All right. Help me out here. Use the chat window. Might be fine. Yeah. It's going fine. Yeah. It might be tough. Maybe somebody tells that. Yeah, it's moving along. There you go. Yeah. My dad would say, oh, got some irons in the fire. That's how he would say it. And what Ken's version of it was, well, there's like two opportunities. I'm chasing down these two opportunities. And that was his way of saying things are moving along, things are going fine, I'm chasing down these two opportunities. But if you listen to his words, he said, I've got these two opportunities. If you listen to the body language, so to speak, or the vocal tone specifically, it didn't sound like he was all that confident. It sounded much more like he was just trying to be positive. And so I'd been reading Decisive at the time. And so this is what I said. I said, so Ken, let's say those two options. I know they sound like they're good. Actually, they didn't. But let's say it sounds like they're good. What if those two went away? Just gone. You heard tomorrow. Doesn't work. What would you do? What would you do? That's the vanishing options test. When you say, let's say those options go away, what would you do next? You know what Ken said? He goes, I think I'd go into consulting. So I'm like, well, Ken, why don't you start looking into consulting right now? He'd been holding off on looking at consulting. Why don't you start looking into consulting now? That's the vanishing options test. When you're trying to look at options, what are the main things you're looking at? Let's say those go away. What would you do? The vanishing options. So it's a powerful idea. And so like how many options is enough? There's some research that says too many options is not good. It's like going to the restaurant where they've got like 5,000 things on the menu and you're like, after a while, just like pick one. So in this case, there is something called the rule of threes, that if you can just at least come up with three, and they need to be three viable options, not just like, all right, I got to come up with another one, another one. In fact, Henry Kissinger said years ago that the typical bureaucratic device was to come up with three options, but two of them they'll just never go for. He said nuclear war, current policy, and surrender. Right? And so that was the way that you'd look like you're trying to come up with options. This is not about coming up with sham options. In fact, you see the kind of the advice here. See if you can fall in love with at least two. That is where I find out if I can come up with three options and two I could really live with. Maybe that third one, it's like, well, it could potentially be viable. And maybe that is the best thing for our company, maybe. but I'd rather not do that. I mean, maybe, potentially, but at least come up with two that you could love, right? So here's the lessons. Next time you find yourself saying, I'm trying to decide whether or not, it's the wrong question. See if you can at least frame it differently. What if we looked at opportunity costs? What am I saying no to? Try the vanishing options test. Maybe find someone else who's fixed the problem. Fall in love with two options. Those are some ways to widen your options, all right? So we're talking about widen your options. How about reality test the assumptions? That's what we need to do. This confirmation bias, we talked about it. Oh, it is so hard to overcome on our own. So this is where getting other people to help us. These researchers here were trying to figure out, the statistics on acquisitions of returning shareholder value. I mean, it's terrible. Terrible. But their theory on why do CEOs keep doing this? Hubris. They want to be walking around the country club. They want to be able to be on the front page of Forbes or the Wall Street Journal, talk about this big one. This is the big deal we struck. Their theory was that. And I'm telling you, hubris, I don't think most of us would say, the problem with my decision-making process, I'm just too darn cocky. Most of us don't say that. But the antidote for hubris is this, disagreement. There's a great story from Alfred Sloan, who for the longest time was the CEO at General Motors. And you know how when the CEO says something and people are like, oh, yeah, good idea, Chief. Yeah. At one point he goes, gentlemen, I take it we're all complete agreement here, right? And they're like, yes, sir. He goes, then I propose we postpone further discussion on this matter until our next meeting to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what this decision is all about. Now, good for Sloan, right? Because how many times do you see an executive do something like this? How many times do we do something like this? No. What I'm like is, oh, good. Everyone's in agreement. Quick, go to the next agenda item so nothing slows down here. So here, whether or not, that's one of the triggers we're trying to get you to think through. The next time you're working with your team and everyone's just like, okay, yeah, good idea, Chief. Yeah, looking good. As much as I like how that sounds, as much as I like how that might feel, keep an eye on it because it could be that people just aren't thinking. In fact, Mike Roberto, I've interviewed Michael twice now on the podcast. One of them was about this book, Why Great Leaders Don't Take Yes for an Answer. Mike's a former Harvard Business School professor and now at Bryant University, I think it's called. And this is really related to the real premise of this book of what we need to do is manage the tension between conflict and consensus. Think about that. Manage this tension between conflict and consensus. Now, it may not be perfectly obvious what he's talking about here, but the problem sometimes, in fact, I had a mentor teach it this way. Maybe this will be helpful for you. He said, sometimes something is a problem to fix. Other times, it's a tension to manage. Now, what was helpful for me for that was I grew up as a software developer. And you know what would often just drive us crazy? All those marketing people or those salespeople, they're promising stuff that we can't deliver. We're a bunch of losers. They're promising stuff we can't deliver. Now, this mentor of mine would say, that's not a problem to fix. It's a tension that you need to manage. Because if they stop getting aggressive, then we're not innovative. And we're not pushing the edge. But if they go too far that way, we never deliver. And so it's managing the tension. And what Mike is saying here is that your job as a leader and my job as a leader is to manage the tension between conflict, like we're going to need some of that, and consensus. We're going to need some of that. Okay. In fact, he's got some vocabulary around this that I don't know about you, but this has been very helpful to me. He calls it cognitive conflict versus affective conflict. And the idea of cognitive conflict is that this is the discussion between where, let's say, something even today, in a discussion, I talk about something, and let's say you in the chat window go, well, I don't know if I agree with that, Andy. And it'd be like, well, let's talk about the example, and we go back and forth. Cognitive conflict on your team is where people are wrestling with the ideas. Like, well, what about this idea? Well, here's my concern if we do it that way, right? That's cognitive conflict. Affective conflict, and Mike's an academic, which is why he uses a term like affective. But affective conflict is, hey, you know what? That's stupid. That idea? Oh, come on. Are some people having trouble hearing? Yeah. I'll up the volume a little bit on this side. Maybe that'll help. Okay. So affective conflict would be when someone's like, hey, you know what? You're a loser. All right. This is when someone is saying, when someone says, you know what? This idea is stupid. Okay. So here's what I want you to get out of this is this difference between cognitive and affective is if you don't have some cognitive, that's not a good sign because that means people might be afraid to even speak up. You need cognitive conflict. If not, you're probably leaving some better options left on the table, so to speak. But affective, you need to jump in front of that right away, okay? So consensus and conflict. If you don't have some cognitive conflict, this is a problem. So be very, very careful with that one, okay? But affective, jump in front of that train right away. Okay? Now, when you're trying to reality test your assumptions, before making that decision, pass them by somebody else. Who else has done something like this? You know, like if you're considering a job at another place, you know, certainly places like Glassdoor, you know, go see, what does Glassdoor say about this place? People that have been on the inside. And it's not like they're going to be perfectly objective, but at least it's data. You could look at it. Let's say, you know, if somebody tells me, oh, I'd love to cook. I think I want to open a restaurant. Instead of saying, you are insane. I don't say that. I just say, you know what? Talk to some people that have done it. Talk to people that have not done it through a franchise. They just opened their own restaurant and talk to them. You got to understand. You got to talk to them. Talk to people that have implemented these infrastructure tools before, because there are a lot of people who spend a lot of money because they listen to a lot of sales pitches, but talk to people that have done it. Reality test your assumptions, because it's amazing how easy it is to believe the glossies, to follow my dreams and not realize that it's a problem. One way to reality test is to zoom in. And the idea of zooming in, it's a little bit like that undercover boss idea. I love this quote from John Galsworthy. Idealism increases in direct proportion to your distance from the problem. Okay. So the further I am away from the actual customer, or the further I am away from the people that have to live with the result of this, then it's a lot easier to be idealistic. And for years at Xerox, some of our senior executives would be customer officer of the day. And there's for years at Merck, I don't know if they still do it. Doesn't matter what the role was. If you are gonna spend time at Merck, you had to carry the sales bag and interact with physicians and do things like that. There's something about getting to the front lines, talking to the people who will use the system that you're making these decisions on. Right? Zoom in, get to the front lines. The ivory tower is terrible when it comes to making decisions. I've heard some people say this is why Washington, D.C. gets so screwed up, because people get too far away from Main Street to understand what the implications of their decisions are. And all of a sudden, the numbers are all big. Everything's big. Everything's billions of dollars. In fact, unless it's hundreds of billions of dollars, like we sneeze less than that. So it's to get to the front lines and be like, what are the people on the front lines? Often the people on our project teams have really good ideas of way to solve our problems, but we don't talk to them. Okay. Now, ooch is kind of an odd word, but it's used by the Heath brothers to say, can you just dip your toe into it? So Adam Grant, it was last year, came out with the book Originals, and he talks about, it's kind of a creativity innovation book, but he gives examples of people that when they started these really famous companies now, that a lot of times people go, well, I could never be that entrepreneurial. Well, most of them didn't quit their job before. Most of them weren't these like massive risk takers. What they did is they started doing it on the side. And so the rough equivalent here is when you're trying to make a decision, one way to reality test your assumption is what they call ooch, which is, can I just try a little bit? This is the pilot. This is well, let's do one test market, or let's try it on one project and then see how that goes. So Jim Collins calls it fire bullets and then cannonballs. And Peter Sims wrote a book called Little Bets. It's that same sort of thing. Is there a version of this? All right. So what I'm doing right now, I do this full time now. I've been doing this since 2001. Before that, as a software developer and a manager and a director and a vice president. And, you know, the higher I got up, the more I have to, just to be perfectly honest, I had less and less joy in what I was doing. And quite frankly, I don't even think I was that great at it. It was taking me away from what I really love to do. But I'm not going to like dive out of the executive suite and go start some business when I don't know if it's going to work. And so I ooched, and I'd go to a conference and say, because conferences are dying for people to speak. And so it's like that, give a case study here, start speaking a little bit on the side, talk to other people that are doing it. That's a career example of starting something on the side and seeing how that goes. That's ooching. And whether it's a career thing, whether it's a project thing, whether it's a product thing, can you dip your toe in first? You can reduce a lot of risk, and you can test your assumptions there. So take it seriously about this cognitive conflict thing. If you don't have some of that, that's a problem. It's to the point now, because I've just learned the hard way, that when I go to, let's say, Amazon to buy something or some other online retailer, I try to go straight to the negative reviews, because everything inside us seems to be wired to go to the positive reviews. Go to the negative ones. And try to not force yourself to go, all right, oh yeah, I'm sure. I see what they're saying, but it was probably like a random freak of nature that they got a bad price. No. Find why is it that these people are saying these things, okay? So reality test your assumptions. So we've got the widen your options, reality test your assumptions, and then get some distance. Attain some distance before we make that decision, okay? Susie Welch, this is Jack Welch's wife, and she calls it the 10-10-10. So you got to make a decision. Well, first of all, think of it. How would I feel about that 10 minutes from now, 10 months from now, 10 years from now, okay? And she goes, before you make that decision, think of it in those different time frames. And how do you feel differently? Now, it's going to feel a little bit different. Like, it's hard to totally predict what it's going to be like that. But I think of people in the past, we hire too quickly and we fire too slowly. And I think about the people that I should have made a decision to let them go. They were toxic, and I'm telling you, the data on how the bad apple impacts a team, Bob Sutton from Stanford's done a lot of research on this. I mean, with just one bad apple, as he defines somebody who's a jerk, which has an academic definition. They violate norms of social behavior, okay? And one slacker, which is they withhold effort. Just one of those can drop a team's productivity by 30 to 40%. 30 to 40%. Think about that. That's like losing 2 days a week out of your team because that one. Well, but that's going to be a tough decision. This person's too valuable. We can't live without them. I won't confront them. All right. How do I feel about that 10 minutes later? I feel good. I didn't have the conversation. 10 months from now, we still got the same bad apple having the impact. 10 years from now, well, maybe that same person's still here. 10 minutes after having the really difficult decision that maybe is to the point where it's going to put them on a performance plan, I don't really feel too good about that. Actually, maybe I would. But now, 10 months from now, maybe that person's out of this organization because we kept tolerating in the past. A phrase that has just wrecked me the last couple of years is you get what you tolerate. You get what you tolerate. And we tolerate too many things because this short term, like, well, let's just make this decision. But we don't think about the long term. We're still tolerating this thing later. So think about 10-10-10. Before you make the decision, how are we going to feel about it 10 minutes from now? Well, maybe not so good, but 10 months from now, we're going to be so glad we did this. 10 years from now, oh yeah, for sure. 10-10-10. The mere exposure principle, it's one of the most studied and proven psychological principles that we just like status quo. That when something invades status quo, it's like, what's up here? And so what's good about recognizing this is when you're making decisions, there's going to be a strong tug towards status quo. Well, I'm trying to decide whether I should quit my job and start a company or not. Well, first of all, we know that's a problem, right? Because it's a whether or not. But even as you look at other options, there's going to be this strong status quo towards, I'm just going to go for the secure thing, like your job's so secure, right? I'm just going to go for that. Yeah, there's going to be this strong tug towards status quo. So being familiar with this can help us say, well, wait a minute. Am I just being too content? Is there another option that I can kind of get some of that contentedness and not go so radical? This is another way to get some distance. Instead of saying, well, what do I do? Say, if my friend was going through this, what would I tell my friend to do? Okay, so here's an example that researchers use. Let's say there's a college student and he sees a girl in one of his classes and he's like, you know what? I'd like to ask her out on a date, right? So what should you do? Wait until you get to know her better or call her, right? So he interviewed people. What would you do? And a lot of people said, I'm going to wait until I get to know her. But then go, if it was your friend, what would you recommend? Call her, right? So if this is me, it'd be like, well, I think I'll get to know her better. But if it's a friend, I'm like, go for it, right? And so I think an example of this is my wife says that if she's got a friend who needs to clean their closets, like my wife is like ninja, to be, able to help. But she goes, when it comes to my own closet, I have trouble letting go of stuff. So one way to attain distance is just say, hey, you know what? What would I do? So if a friend was here, this is what Andy Grove and Gordon Moore did. If somebody replaced us at Intel, what would we do? Peter Bregman, and I've interviewed Peter twice. He has a book called 4 Seconds, and he goes, man, a nice long breath before you decide. It's just enough time to let the prefrontal cortex take over from the amygdala. And aren't there times when you get really amped? I mean, you're like really amped. You're like, oh yeah, you see what they put in that email? No way. You're like, crank it out, just send it. And there's a lot of pain in life because we didn't take that nice long breath. Aren't there times you wish you would have counted to 10,000? Aren't there times instead of saying in that meeting, a guy named Tony Schwartz told me in an interview, he wrote a book called The Way We're Working Isn't Working. And Tony Schwartz said, he calls it his rule of triggers. Whenever you feel like you must, don't. Whenever you feel like you must, don't. That's this idea. So be aware of, things that are just drive us in the short term to make these decisions. Give it a 10-10-10, just be aware that there's going to be a strong status quo bias. Maybe look at what would a friend do? Take that deep breath. Those are some ways to deal with it. And then there's prepare to be wrong. Prepare to be wrong. This is the one that's often missing. And here's what I want to know. I mean, how would you define the difference between persistence and denial of reality? Use the chat window here. How would you say, well, is that persistence or is that denial of reality? What would you say? I'm thinking of people, go ahead and type in the chat window. I'm thinking of people that are like making a business decision, and are they being persistent or are they just like so wrong? You see this with the sports team. We still have that same quarterback. Is that persistence or is it denial of reality that that person's never going to work out, right? When is it persistence? When is it denial of reality? Anybody got an opinion on this one? Persistence is knowing when to deny reality. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I've actually worked with the McCaskey family before on a consulting basis. Nothing to do with this. The team is more of the family interactions, the business side of their family. But it is interesting how you see sports teams just hang with the, like the quarterback, for example. Persistence when you're moving ahead. So it's persistence because you're making some progress, where denial of reality is you're like, no progress is being made. Here's the deal. I actually think it's really, really hard to tell. And the only thing you know when it's persistence or denial of reality is how it turns out. Because we tell people all the time, don't make assumptions. Don't assume. Don't assume, because you know what the word assume means, right? But assume is something that you are, when we say that, it's because the decision or the assumption turns out to be bad. And so see, you assumed. But if it would have turned out to be a good assumption, that would have been like, that was fabulous planning. That was great. And so it's often difficult to know. And so how do you deal with this? Well, the best way I've learned on this one is you set a tripwire. And so you go, all right, listen, we're going to make this decision. Yeah, well, you're right. It is critical. And you need to be able to give it time. And so, John, this idea of setting the tripwire can say, I'm going to be persistent. And I'm going to give myself this long to be persistent. But if at this point it's not cash flowing, if at this point that option isn't working, if at this point whatever, then what are we going to do? So you set the tripwire. And this is like on a stock investment. When you do the buy, you also create some sort of stop loss. Okay? Because the problem is, if you don't set the tripwire, like I know a guy started a business. Actually, it's kind of similar business that I'm in. And I don't know if it's because of the particular topics. I don't know if it's something about him. I don't know about how he marketed, but he went 5 years and he blew through an inheritance and he was miserable. And he just like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Is that persistence or denial of reality? If you would have set a tripwire, let's say 2 years into it, and go, now listen, if I get there and I'm not able to pay for my bills, I'm out of here. I'm going to go get a different job. There's a notorious project up in Canada, the Canadian Firearms Registry. It's you look up anytime cost overruns on projects, it's often the number one. $2 million Canadian is the estimate, okay? Canadian Firearms Registry. $2 million is the estimate, Canadian. It ends up being almost $1 billion. From 2 million to almost $1 billion. And they flushed it 16 years later. Just imagine if they would have set a tripwire like 8 years into it, like, guys, we're idiots. Think of how much they could have paid for, like, you know, all kinds of schools and all kinds of other stuff. So set a tripwire. It's just, you know, there's an example in the Decisive book as somebody goes, you know, someday I want to go to Argentina. There's a lady. Someday I want to go to Argentina. They're late teens. But, you know, there's college and, you know, there's a lot of bills with college. And so I'll wait until I'm out of college. Well, you know, I got to get a job. So I got a job. Well, I can't take, there's not enough time to take off. I don't have enough vacation. So I'm going to wait until I earn up some more vacation. Well, all right, now I'm married and we've got some young kids, but the kids are so young, they're not going to remember Argentina. So let's wait until they get older. Except as they're getting older, there's ballet and soccer and lacrosse and orchestra. And they're like, oh, let's wait till they get to college. But college, we can't afford to go to Argentina right now. The way the story goes is she eventually had some health problems and could not travel. So the question is, when did she decide to not go to Argentina? Think about that. I think if she was here and we put a microphone in her face, she'd go, I never decided that. I never made that decision. But in fact, every day there's a problem that she was making that decision not to. So that was the issue. And so here's the deal. What are these letters? You can try it in the chat window if you're able to type quick enough. You encounter a choice. What's the W stand for? It's the W. Yeah, Sabrina, you're exactly right. Not choosing is still a choice. The W, what I want you to do, widen your options. The R, yeah, widen. That's exactly it, guys. Widen your options. What's the R? You know, we've got those assumptions out there. We have to reality test our assumptions. That's right. And you might even call retest. That would actually be okay. It's reality test them. That's exactly it. The A is a little bit more difficult because it sounds like assumptions. They're stretching for the acronym, but it's attain some distance. Attain some distance. That's right. And then P, prepare to be wrong. That's what the process looks like. That's what the process is. We're going to end our time with this. I want you to do a little brainstorming. You have an administrative assistant who's struggling in her role. She's handling the expense tracking and database stuff okay, but struggling with the more social aspects of her job. And, you know, the first point of contact, phone communication, more introverted than you thought. So, you know, and this whole social side is pretty critical. It's impacting the effectiveness of your department, okay? See where we're at? Let's face it, firing the person is not an easy option. I was with somebody from the federal government earlier this week, and they're just saying, man, once we hire somebody, it is so hard to get rid of them. So let's say, you know, firing is not an option, strict rules. You're trying to figure whether or not you should fire her, all right? So first of all, what's wrong with the even way we framed that up? Type it in the chat window. What's wrong with the way that we framed it? Whether or not. That's exactly it. Don't make the either or. So let's widen the options here. What would be some options? And, you know, once again, don't worry about getting it too elaborate in paragraphs, but yeah, somewhere else. Kind of frame it as is it a development thing? You know, can we do some training? Yeah, have we even talked to her? Or are we just like, hey, you know, it's not working out? How about this? Maybe I'm assuming that she's struggling there, but she's actually doing fine. You know, Because you know how sometimes we're like, oh, well, she ought to be saying it this way because that's the way I would. Well, maybe she's being perfectly acceptable, or maybe not. But did we make expectations clear? Is there enough work on the whole database side and expense tracking to carve it out, and she could do that, and we bring in somebody temporary for this? Could we set a tripwire and say, hey, listen, you know what? Is this something that you want to learn? Because to be effective, these are the things. Now, we'll give you training, and you know what? If things are going well 6 months from now, then that is awesome. If they're not, we'll try to find something else for you. But you set the expectation. Too often, we don't do that. So you see how it's just so easy to not do this. So you can reality test your assumptions, talk to somebody else, attain distance before you have the conversation with her, have a practice how you'd say it. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do, but you could set the tripwire that says, you know what, if things don't get better in these areas, even after the training and the coaching and everything else, then maybe we make a move towards finding a better job for her. Right? So here's the deal. WRAP. Try to remember that. Widen your options. Reality test your assumptions. Attain some distance. And then prepare to be wrong. I'd love it if in the chat window you just type in, what's an example of something that you're like, you know what, this was helpful from our discussion today. What's an example of something you're like, yeah, I appreciate these hawk talks. Here's something I'm taking away from today. What would you say? Yeah. We have to thank the Heath brothers for that. Yeah. Yeah. Think about, apply it towards a position. Yeah, that WRAP model. I think it's pretty easy. That whole ooch idea. Yeah, put your toes in the water. Widen the options for sure. Just be careful about the whether or not. Yeah. Well, I'm telling you, I've had a couple opportunities to get involved with your alumni group, and I love the way that you guys continue to invest in each other and to build each other up and provide opportunities. So thank you for this opportunity to spend time with you today. And Chanel, thank you for organizing it. And I'll be around. I've got some time here until the bottom of the hour if people want to put any questions into the chat window. But Chanel, thank you so much. I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We can keep your same screen just in case anyone has questions for Andy. You can ask over the phone or in the group chat. Okay. I do have information that I would like to share with you all about our next Hawk Talk. Give me a moment to be the presenter. Okay, so this is our next Hawk Talk. It is on May 8th. And please continue to send questions if you guys have any. But our next Hawk Talk is Monday, May 8th. We have an alum, Mark Wallace, who's going to give a presentation on leveraging an engineering education to develop a successful career. I think that Andy's talk today will go perfectly with that, just making the decision to make a transition. We hope that you all can join us. You can go right on our website, which is listed here in the slide. If you would like to register, and we'll also be sending emails. Also, if you have questions for Andy that come up later, you can email us at alumni@iit.edu, and I can send those questions directly over to Andy. And thank you all for joining us today. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the call. It looks like most of our callers are leaving. And thank you again, Andy. This was awesome.